In this video, we're going to continue building up a series of philosophical skills that are going to be relevant to our study of medical ethics. So in this one, we're going to learn about a popular and powerful mode of moral reasoning. Sometimes that will be referred to as consequentialism, and other times, more specifically, it will be referred to as utilitarianism. So in our last video about critical thinking, I mentioned that one skill philosophers use a great deal is thought experiments. And I introduced you to this one right here. And this thought experiment tells us that there is a runaway trolley going down the tracks. There's 5 people on the track here. There's one person on the track here, and you can pull a lever. If you pull the lever, it will go to the side track and it will kill one person. If you do nothing, then the trolley will keep rolling down the track and hit those 5 and kill them. So the question here is, would it be morally right? We might even ask, is it morally required for you to pull the switch? And you may have had the thought, at least it's a common thought. I would say about 90% of people will say it's morally better to pull the switch than to do nothing. And when I ask why it's better to pull the switch than do nothing, oftentimes I'll get an answer roughly along these lines. They will say that it's better to pull the switch because 5 dead is a worse result than 1 dead. And when you can make a difference, you should pull the switch. Now, I've had other students, this is the smaller minority, saying you shouldn't pull the switch because it's not on you that these 5 people are tied to the tracks and that there's a trolley coming for them. But if this person were to die, that would be on you. You don't want to be the cause of that death. But notice what's going on with that mode of reasoning. It says that there's something more than just the overall consequences. It's about whether you want to have contributed to the situation in a certain way. Oftentimes the response back from the other side on that line of thought will be, well, doing nothing is a choice just as much as doing something is a choice. So by not pulling the switch, you'd be responsible for the death of the 5. And in that way, we have to say, well, if you're going to be responsible for either choice, we should go back to this line of thought that says, do the thing that leads to fewer people dead than the other option. And this line of thought that says, look, when you're in a bad situation, make the best of it that you can, try to get the best result, that is emblematic of consequentialist reasoning. And as a broader theory of ethics, we can say it's a theory of normative ethics. This is just a theory of how to tell the difference between right and wrong, and maybe a more general principle about how right and wrong are differentiated. So the consequentialist is going to explain the difference between a morally right and a morally wrong action. And here's what they're going to state. They're going to say an action is morally required just because it produces the best overall results. So if you have a situation with the best results, that's what your moral job to do was, right? If something is the best result, that's what morality recommends. And anytime we have a real moral requirement, the only way you can get to being morally required to do something is from best results. So this is just because phrase indicates that it's because of this and only because of this. So if and only if. Right? And that means that there's going to be a perfect overlap between the right actions and the actions with the best result. Sometimes consequentialists will refer to the action with the best result as the optimific choice. We're going to say an action is optimific if, given all your choices, you couldn't get a better result from any of the other ones. So it's the choice that leads to the best. Yeah. So when we notice this just because phrase, it means like this is an if and only if relation. Another way we could put it is if we had a Venn diagram with the right actions, and we would actually have another circle that's a perfect overlap, right? We would also say that the right actions are the actions that are optimific, right? That has the best result. Okay, so I've told you about consequentialism. It's the theory that says the right thing to do is the action with the optimific, that is the best result. The most famous version of consequentialism is utilitarianism. So different people will have different views about what the best result is, for instance. So utilitarianism is a more specific version of consequentialism. So when we learn about act utilitarianism, that's going to be often what we're going to go to when we think about consequentialist reasoning. And if you're an act utilitarian, you're going to say that there's one ultimate moral standard. Basically, when we think about ethics, we just apply this one rule over and over and over again. And every time it's supposed to give us the right answer to our moral dilemmas. So here's what the principle of utility states. It says an action is morally required just because it does more to improve overall well-being than any other action you could have done in the circumstances. So you look at actions on a case-by-case basis, and the thing that we're going to focus on is called overall well-being. So in the first definition of consequentialism, it just said aim for the best results. Part of what we're going to do with act utilitarianism is we're going to say apply that on a case-by-case basis, and the thing that we're going to aim for is what we're going to call overall well-being. So if we go back to our trolley example, for instance, we would say that we are promoting overall well-being by deciding to pull the switch instead of doing nothing, right? So another way of putting this is we want to create as much happiness in the universe as we can, right? Now, the other thing to notice is we're talking about overall well-being, right? So what does this mean? Well, we're not just focusing on our own personal well-being or the well-being of our family and friends. Instead, utilitarianism says everybody's well-being matters equally. So we're going to say, for instance, that the pain of stubbing my toe, that actually detracts from overall well-being. It's an instance of suffering. So we would say that detracts. But let's say, there's something happy that comes to me, like the joy of listening to really good music or the pleasure of eating ice cream. Well, that would be a small contribution to the overall happiness of the world. So what we're going to do for utilitarianism is we're going to think about how we can enhance or decrease the well-being of any particular individual. And then we're going to say, well, try to go for the one with the most net happiness over suffering, right? So when we're talking about overall well-being, we're thinking about the good stuff with the bad stuff subtracted, and we're going to think about everybody. And then if we can say that, look, we get a surplus of happiness when we have people who are made happy, but there's not suffering canceling it out. We just want to look at all of our options and figure out which action creates the biggest surplus of happiness over suffering for the group, right? And if we sort of take that really broad view where everybody's interests are taken into consideration and we go for the best overall result, that's with the bad stuff canceling out the good stuff and counting everybody, then that's how we're going to find out what the right thing to do is. So when we're talking about maximizing goodness, we can make a couple of clarifications. Here are some ways that people misunderstand utilitarianism. Sometimes people say, well, you just count, right? You do whatever benefits the greatest number of people. Just because we're benefiting more people than we hurt, that might not necessarily be the right thing. Because, for instance, this is a weird example, but this is how philosophers think. I could perform an action that makes 10 people $1 richer, but at the same time, one person gets their arm amputated painfully. Now, we might say that that is benefiting 10 people, as opposed to, let's say, making 10 people $1 poorer and saving a child's eyesight. We might say, well, in these two things, in the first one, we made 10 people better off and one person worse off. But we made the 10 people a little better off and the one person much worse off. Right? And in the second example, I made 10 people a little worse off. They lost $1, but the one person, the child, regained their eyesight. You might think that makes them a lot better off. Like most people would pay far more than $10 to preserve or regain their eyesight, which indicates that if we had those two options in front of us, we would actually choose the action that benefits only one person and makes worse off 10 people, even though if we're thinking about the intensity of the benefits and the intensity of the harms, the one that benefits fewer could actually be the thing that promotes overall well-being more so. Now, the other misunderstanding, we should choose the action that creates the greatest amount of happiness. Well, that could be true, often is, but if we're creating a great amount of suffering along the way, we might actually realize that that suffering is going to cancel out some of the happiness, right? So you can't just look at the happiness. You need to look at what we might call overall well-being, which is happiness over suffering. We have to figure out how much suffering is being canceled out. So both of these views are not utilitarianism. So the utilitarian is going to say, the actual view, we've got to perform the act that creates the greatest net balance of happiness over unhappiness. So we're taking this broad perspective, we're taking everybody into account, and we're looking for the best overall result. Okay, so that's basically the picture of utilitarianism. We're going to think about the consequences of our actions. We're going to think about the well-being of everybody. And we're going to try to find the action that leads to the most well-being, just so long as it's not canceled out by suffering. So we're looking for the greatest amount of net happiness over suffering. That's what we're talking about when we talk about overall well-being. This is a theory that has both benefits and drawbacks. So here are some of the benefits. One thing we might notice is impartiality, right? So according to the utilitarian, everybody's interests count the same. My suffering makes a moral difference to the world, but so does yours. My happiness is, from the point of view of morality, important, but so is yours, right? So it seems plausible to most of us at the outset that utilitarianism does a nice job of capturing something about the way that morality is impartial. Second thing to notice is that you can use utilitarianism to justify conventional moral wisdom. So it's not like you come into an ethics class knowing nothing about ethics. In fact, you know quite a lot. And one thing that you'll know is sort of the basic stuff that just about everybody can agree on, right? So we might think of slavery, rape, or killing as obvious examples of terrible things that a person could do to another person, right? And we might think these acts are deeply wrong because they make people so much worse off. The ways in which a person suffers if they are enslaved or if they are sexually assaulted, it's a completely dehumanizing and painful, traumatic thing to go through. We might say the reason why we understand the wrongness of these actions is because we have an understanding of the suffering that victims go through. Killing, we might think that, like, look, there's nothing scarier than being killed. Moreover, if a person gets killed, that makes it impossible for them to enjoy the good things in life that they would have had in store if they hadn't been killed. So, utilitarianism, when we assume that life is good and worth living, is going to give us a good reason to save people's lives. So that seems to be another benefit of utilitarianism. Third one, moral flexibility. When you talk with people about ethics, if you ask them, well, is stealing wrong? Is lying wrong? Any number of things. We could ask the question, well, how do we answer these questions? A lot of people will tell you on questions like that, well, it depends. This is how philosophers ought to respond to the question, or the saying, it depends. Well, we can ask, it depends on what, right? And if we answer the question, well, what does it depend on? When we say that, sometimes it's okay to steal, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's okay to lie, sometimes it's not. Well, the answer that the utilitarian will give us is, well, you should usually not steal because stealing hurts people. It makes it harder for a business person to run their business, passes on higher prices to other people. It makes insurance more expensive. All these sorts of things, we might say, those lead to a bad consequence, right? But if we're talking about one theft of one loaf of bread from a large, multinational supermarket chain, we might say the harm to that supermarket chain and the effect on bread prices in general, there's not going to be much of a difference. But if that makes a difference between your family, being able to sleep with food in their stomachs or not that night, we might say, in that instance, this explains why it's okay to steal bread in that instance. Usually good to not lie, but in cases where you know that you would emotionally devastate somebody by telling them the truth, maybe it's okay to tell a fib, right? And to the extent that a lot of people want to say a lot of the big moral questions depend, utilitarianism can say, yeah, we can take that a step further. It depends on exactly what sorts of results we're going to get out of this particular situation. So those are some of the motivations for why you might find utilitarianism to be a plausible theory. But utilitarianism also seems to have considerable drawbacks. So far from it, not every moral philosopher is a utilitarian. Some people find utilitarianism to be a deeply implausible theory. So one thing that's pointed out is that utilitarianism is a very demanding theory. Because it says, look at all your options, and then figure out which one leads to the most net happiness over suffering for everybody, and do that one. For one thing, we might say, it's really, really hard to know the consequences of all of our actions, so it's really hard to know whether we've actually done the thing that leads to the most happiness over suffering. Another challenge that's raised against this is the point that even if you do know what leads to the most happiness over suffering, we'll notice that utilitarianism says you're doing the wrong thing unless you do the very best. Now, notice that this might mean, you might have $100 to spend. And one thing you could do is spend it on yourself, buy a new pair of shoes. Another thing you might do is give that to your nephew to buy school supplies. Or the third thing you might do is give it to a very effective charity, a charity like the Against Malaria Foundation. They pay for bed nets in countries where malaria is a problem, often Africa, and these bed nets help stop these people from getting mosquito bites, which stops them from getting malaria, a disease which kills very many people. And then you might think, well, what do I spend this money on? Do I spend the money on my shoes, help my nephew out with school supplies, or the Against Malaria Foundation? Now, if you sort of sat down and did the math, you might realize that your $100 is going to do the most work for the Against Malaria Foundation. But you might also realize that if that's the case, then giving the money to the shoe store for some new shoes or giving the money to your nephew to get them school supplies, well, either of those choices are wrong because you could have done something better with the money, right? But we might think that once we start thinking in this mode of thought, that you're doing the wrong thing unless you've done the best with your choices, well, that seems like utilitarianism is asking a whole lot of us, right? It's asking us to make big sacrifices, and unless you've done the very best you possibly could have, you've done something wrong. A lot of people think that that's a reason to think that utilitarianism is excessively demanding. Because I bet a lot of you think that it would be perfectly fine to go ahead and buy yourself a new pair of shoes. And you might also think that it's perfectly admirable to do something charitable, but something charitable that isn't necessarily the thing that's going to lead to the very best result, like helping your nephew buy school supplies. So that's a first objection against utilitarianism. A second objection is that utilitarianism seems to require sometimes unjust actions. Now, let me explain, and then I'll give you an example to wrap things up here. When we talk about unjust actions, in this context, I'll mean violating somebody's rights, right? We might talk about somebody's rights to property or bodily autonomy and so forth. But utilitarianism says if you can create more happiness than suffering by violating somebody's rights, you should violate their rights. So here's a final thought experiment that we'll end with. It says you are working at a hospital, and the patient comes to the emergency room unconscious with a head injury that they would never recover from. The patient has O negative blood, which makes them a universal blood donor. And you're also aware that there are several patients upstairs in the hospital in need of organ transplants. So 2 of these people need kidneys, 1 person needs a heart, 1 needs a lung, and 1 needs a liver. And for philosophical thought experiments, we can stipulate certain things. So even though this would probably never happen in the real world, we're going to say that in this case, these 5 people in need of organs are almost certainly going to die in the next week, but not if we donate some organs to them, the ones that they need, of course. And do you realize for a second that you could actually find a way to kill this patient? Maybe they are relying on a respirator right now. And you realize that you could kill the patient and use their organs viably, right? And if you were to kill the patient secretly, nobody would ever find out. But you would be able to kill that one patient and save the lives of those 5 people in need of organs. Right? And we ask the question, should you kill that patient and distribute their organs? Now, with the trolley example that I gave at the top, we said, yeah, most people think you should pull the switch, and the principle behind it would be, well, it's better for 1 person to die than for 5 people to die. We might notice here, well, aren't we just choosing between the death of 1 person and the death of 5 people? And we might think, oh my goodness, well, it would seem that utilitarianism is saying, look, if it leads to a better result, 5 lives saved rather than 1 person living at the end of it, we might say that would be a reason, that would be a seemingly plausible reason to say utilitarianism will require you to end the life of this unconscious person in your emergency room. But the implausibility of this shows that maybe there are some limits on maximizing utility. That if it's requiring you to do something unjust, then maybe utilitarianism goes too far. Now, within the context of practical ethics, applied medical ethics, we can notice that utilitarianism won't be the end-all be-all theory. For one, within medical ethics, we do expect providers to respect the rights of patients. But we should also notice that for many cases, the justifications that we're going to be giving for medical ethical cases are going to be based on considerations of whether our actions are helping, whether they're hurting, and whether the helps are much greater than the hurts in the long run. And in this way, we need to be familiar with utilitarianism and consequentialist reasoning, because we'll see it emerging in all sorts of different ways within a course on medical ethics. So, thanks for listening in. Be well. And if you need anything from me, don't hesitate to reach out. Okay, take care.